Rick Malone sat alone at the kitchen table, the soft glow of the Christmas tree lights flickering in the corner of the room. The house was silent, save for the faint hum of the fridge and the distant sound of wind outside, pushing the cold against the windows. He wrapped the last of the gifts, carefully folding the paper, securing the edges with tape, and placing them neatly in the box. He hadn't been able to do this for years. Not since Emily was a little girl. Back then, she'd always help her small hands clumsy but eager to get everything just right. But now, she was grown. She had her own life, her own world, one that didn't have room for the man who raised her. His fingers were stiff as he put the last piece of tape on the final package. He stared at it for a moment before picking up his phone, checking the time. 11:47 p.m. It was Christmas Eve. He hoped she'd reach out, maybe send a message, tell him they'd love to have him over for dinner, even if it was just out of courtesy. He'd made peace with the idea that he wasn't the centerpiece of her world anymore. He never expected to be. But there was always hope, a small flicker in the quiet places of his heart, that she might still care. The phone buzzed in his hand, pulling him out of his thoughts. One new message. Emily. "Don't come, Dad, you embarrass us." The words hit him like a punch. He didn't flinch, didn't move, just stared at the screen, trying to process the weight of them, trying to understand why they felt like a knife twisting into his gut. He reread it, slowly, as if that would change anything. But the message was clear. No room for him. Not tonight. Not ever again, it seemed. His heart sank, heavy and hollow. It wasn't the first time Emily had made him feel like this. The first time was when she'd insisted he pay for the house. Not because she needed him, no. It was because she couldn't bear the thought of living in a less-than neighborhood. Rick had never understood that need for status, but he'd done it anyway. For her, he'd kept quiet, swallowed the hurt, because she was his daughter, his only daughter. But this was different. He could hear Jason's voice in his head, taunting him. That look Jason always gave him. The look that said he was just a man who didn't belong in their world, with his faded work boots and his hands calloused from decades of hard labor. Embarrassing was a word that had been thrown at him more times than he cared to count. But this was coming from Emily, his own flesh and blood. He didn't reply. He couldn't. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like he was begging for her approval, for a place in her life that had been so casually given to someone else. Instead, he put the phone down. His fingers lingered on the edge for just a second before he let it fall onto the table with a soft thud. The silence in the room deepened. Rick's eyes drifted to the papers scattered on the table in front of him, the house deed. The thing he'd held onto for so long. The thing that had once been a symbol of his love and sacrifice for Emily. His hands curled into fists as he stared at them. He had never told her he was still paying the mortgage. She never needed to know. Not while she was living her life in that big house, surrounded by all the trappings of success she so desperately craved. But now, he wondered if she'd even noticed the house would eventually fall from beneath her. Maybe that was the point. He hadn't wanted to believe it before, but now he was certain. She and Jason had been playing him, using him as their safety net, their quiet benefactor. And all the while, they had treated him like a burden. The anger that had been building since that first, distant conversation with Jason a few months ago flared up again. He couldn't stay silent any longer, not when Emily had so clearly cast him aside. A quiet decision began to form, as calm and cold as the snow falling outside his window. He picked up the deed papers, feeling the weight of them in his hands, like an anchor pulling him towards something he wasn't sure he could escape. His thumb brushed over the signature lines, his signature. He'd made those payments month after month, year after year. The words from Emily's text echoed in his mind. "You embarrass us." Maybe it was time to make sure she saw him, to make sure she finally understood what it meant to owe him, what it meant to pay for her choices, just like he had for years. Rick's hand tightened around the papers. His breath slowed. He didn't know exactly how it would unfold, but in that moment, he understood one thing with crystal clarity. He was done. Done playing the fool. Done being invisible. The phone buzzed again. Another message from Emily. But Rick didn't reach for it. Instead, he stared out the window at the falling snow, his mind already a few steps ahead. A decision had been made. And tomorrow, Christmas Day, would be the beginning of something different. Rick's old truck rumbled down the quiet suburban street, its engine a constant hum that filled the silence of the cold winter evening. He drove slowly, the tires crunching softly over the frost-covered pavement, as he approached the large house that used to be home to his daughter, Emily's house, the one he had made possible. Month after month, year after year, the house loomed ahead, glowing with Christmas lights, reds and greens flashing against the stark white of the snow. It was the kind of place people like him were supposed to admire from a distance. People like him, the ones who worked their entire lives to give their families something better, only to have it thrown back in their faces. He slowed the truck even more, taking in the spectacle of it, the garlands draped over the porch, the flickering candles in the windows. It was beautiful, yes, but it wasn't his. Not anymore. He'd never told Emily how much it ate at him, how every light, every decoration, felt like a dagger in his chest, not just because he had paid for it all, but because she had promised him, promised she would always appreciate him, would always be grateful for what he did, for what he sacrificed. But as the years passed, that promise had faded, like the glow of the lights now flickering before him. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. 8 years. 8 years he had quietly paid the mortgage. Not a word of thanks or recognition from her. Emily hadn't asked for help, she demanded it, and he had given it, out of love, out of duty. Because that's what fathers did. He thought it was just a temporary thing, a way to give her a little breathing room until things were better. But things had never gotten better. They'd only gotten worse. Jason had never once looked him in the eye with anything but disdain. And now Emily, his own flesh and blood, had decided he was a burden. He could still hear the words from her text, biting and sharp. "You embarrass us." Rick could feel the old ache in his chest again, the kind that never fully healed. He remembered the first time Emily had bought this house. It was supposed to be a fresh start. She was so proud of it. Jason had been there too, of course standing next to her with that smirk, the one that always made Rick feel like an outsider. But Emily had been radiant, a promise of a life she thought she deserved, and he had been happy to give it to her. She was his daughter, after all. But now, as he watched the house from across the street, it was like a monument to his failure, his inability to protect her from the hollowness of the life she was chasing. Jason had mocked Rick's truck months ago. He remembered it vividly, the way Jason had laughed when Rick showed up at Emily's with a flat tire, his hands covered in grease. "You really need to get yourself a new truck, old man," Jason had said with that smug, self-assured grin, the kind of smile that made Rick feel like he was nothing more than a relic, something that was supposed to be put out to pasture. The mockery was subtle, but it stung. It always did. He let out a slow breath, trying to push back the bitterness that threatened to consume him. No, he wasn't going to let this make him weak. Not again. Not when he'd been invisible for so long. Rick parked the truck a few houses down, just out of view. He didn't want to be seen, not yet. He just wanted to watch, to see them living their perfect lives while he sat in the shadows. The lights twinkled, casting a warm glow against the cold night. There was laughter from inside, the soft sound of voices mingling with the music drifting from the open windows. A Christmas party. It was all so perfect, so effortless. And yet, it wasn't real. None of it was. For the first time in a long while, Rick didn't feel like a part of it. He felt like an outsider in the life he'd created. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking him from his thoughts. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. Frank. Rick exhaled, his hand already moving to answer. Frank was the only one who knew the full extent of what was going on, the quiet payments he'd been making on the house, the way Jason had manipulated him, the way Emily had distanced herself. Frank had always been a solid guy, someone Rick could trust. He could use that now. He needed to know for sure if what he was considering was even possible. "Rick." Frank's voice came through, a little muffled by the static, but still clear. "What's going on?" Rick paused, his gaze still fixed on the house. "I need you to check something for me. Something about Emily's mortgage." Frank hesitated for a moment, then agreed. "I'll pull the files. Give me a minute." Rick nodded even though Frank couldn't see him. He hung up and placed the phone back in his pocket. He could feel the weight of the decision already starting to settle over him. Something was going to change. He wasn't sure what it would be, or how, but it was time. The house, the lights, the illusion of everything being perfect, it was all about to come crashing down. He sat in the truck for a long time, staring at the house. The snow continued to fall, covering everything in a layer of white, as if trying to erase the truth he could no longer ignore. And in that moment, Rick knew nothing would ever be the same again. Rick sat in his truck, the engine still idling, the air thick with the weight of the moment. He stared out the windshield, eyes fixed on the soft glow of Emily's house in the distance. The warmth from the Christmas lights seemed a cruel contrast to the chill that had settled in his chest. His phone buzzed in his pocket again, the same low hum that he had been trying to avoid. Frank, he'd been waiting for this call. Rick answered without a word, the tension in his shoulders not quite easing. Frank was always direct. If there was a truth to be uncovered, he'd find it. Rick trusted him, even if he wasn't sure he wanted to hear what Frank might say. "Rick." Frank's voice crackled through the line. "I've got the papers in front of me. You're still the legal mortgage holder." Rick's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He hadn't doubted it, not really. But hearing it confirmed out loud felt like a punch to the gut. The mortgage was still in his name, the responsibility still his, just like it had been for the last 8 years. All those years, silently paying for the house, while Emily never even knew how deeply it ate at him, how each payment was another piece of his pride slipping away. He took a breath, trying to steady himself. "I thought she refinanced," Rick muttered, though he already knew the answer. He'd known deep down, but hearing the truth hit harder than he expected. "She didn't," Frank said flatly. "She never refinanced like she promised." Jason pushed her to keep it quiet. "Make sure you kept paying, no questions asked." And she went along with it. Rick's heart stuttered in his chest. He had known Jason was a snake, but this was something else. It wasn't just manipulation. It was calculated deceit. Jason had made sure that Emily stayed in his pocket, using her own father to fund a lifestyle he could never afford on his own. And Emily, his daughter, the one he had raised, the one he had given everything for, had played along with it. She'd let Jason pull the strings while she sat back, letting her father shoulder the weight of their lives, never once lifting a finger to stop it. Frank's voice broke through his thoughts. "Rick, I hate to say it, but you've been used." The words hit harder than he expected. Rick squeezed his eyes shut, the anger rising in his chest like a fire he couldn't extinguish. Used. That's what it was. He had been nothing more than a tool to them, a way to keep their lives comfortable while they pretended to be a family. Rick had spent 8 years watching his daughter live her life, pouring money into a house that was supposed to be a home, only to realize now that it was nothing but a facade. Jason had been right about one thing: he wasn't soft. No, he was a fool. Rick sat in silence, the weight of Frank's words sinking deeper into his bones. His mind raced, his thoughts spinning, but nothing seemed to make sense anymore. How had he allowed this to happen? How had he let it go on for so long? His phone buzzed again, and this time, it wasn't Frank. He looked down at the screen. Emily. She had posted something online. His finger hovered over the screen for a moment before he tapped the message open. It was a picture of her and Jason at a family gathering, surrounded by smiling faces. The holiday cheer was thick in the air, the perfect family portrait. Only one thing was missing. Rick. He was nowhere to be found. There were no signs of him in the background, no nod to his presence at all. Just the two of them, wrapped in their perfect, curated little world. And it stung. The emptiness of it was suffocating. It wasn't just that he wasn't in the picture. It was that he had been erased from the narrative of his own family. His hand shook as he put the phone down on the seat next to him. The betrayal was sharp now, clear and unmistakable. This wasn't about just money anymore. This was about something deeper, something he had failed to see until now. He felt the anger bubble up, thick and hot, but instead of letting it spill over, he swallowed it down. He wasn't going to react. Not yet. He wasn't going to let them see him weak. Not after all this. Rick reached over and turned his phone off, shutting out the world for a moment. He couldn't look at her face, couldn't let her words keep cutting through him. The truth was out now. Emily and Jason had shown him who they really were. And in the quiet of his truck, with the cold wind blowing outside, Rick made a decision. He wasn't going to be invisible anymore. The game was changing, and this time, he would be the one calling the shots. The house was warm, the kind of warmth that wrapped around you like a blanket, filled with the rich scent of roasting turkey and the sharp, tangy sweetness of cranberry sauce. Emily's house, large, impeccably decorated, the Christmas tree towering in the corner, adorned with sparkling ornaments that probably cost more than Rick's entire wardrobe. Everything was in its place. The guests were arriving, dressed in their finest, each one more polished than the next. A picture-perfect Christmas Eve, the kind you see on the covers of magazines. But Rick wasn't there. Instead, Emily and Jason were hosting, surrounded by their friends, their perfect lives unfolding in real time. Jason stood by the door, greeting guests with that smug smile of his, the one that always made Rick feel like an intruder, even when he had a right to be there. Emily moved gracefully through the room, her laughter light and bright, a mask of perfection. But Rick knew her better than that. He could tell, just from watching her from a distance, that something was off. Her eyes avoided the window when she passed by, as if she feared he might be watching. Maybe she was. Maybe she wasn't. Jason's voice cut through the low hum of the party, his words sharp and dismissive as always. "Rick would ruin the image," he said, loud enough for Emily to hear. "You know how he is. His truck, his look, people would think we're slumming it. This is supposed to be an event." Rick could feel the sting of those words, as if they were aimed directly at him, a quiet insult that was all too familiar. Emily hesitated, her fingers pausing mid-air as she adjusted the wine glasses on the table. She caught Rick's reflection in the window for a split second, then quickly looked away. There it was, the moment where everything changed. She had to choose loyalty to her father or comfort with the life she'd built for herself. And she chose comfort. She always did. Rick's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. He ignored it. By the time the evening rolled on, the laughter in the house was louder, more forced. The kind of fake joy that stung when you knew the truth behind it. Emily's phone buzzed, and she glanced at it quickly, tapping out a response. A message from Rick, he guessed. She couldn't even bring herself to reach out to him, not after what had happened. The last text he'd sent her, "Don't come, Dad. You embarrass us," was enough to sever whatever thread of connection was left between them. Late that night, after the guests had left, Rick sat alone in his small, dimly lit living room, the weight of the evening settling heavily on his shoulders. His phone buzzed again. "Lydia," he picked up, his voice tight. "Hey, Lydia. Why are you so quiet? What's going on, Dad?" Her voice was soft but concerned, the kind of concern that made him feel guilty. "I'm just tired," Rick lied, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "It's been a long day." Lydia didn't press further, but Rick could hear the hesitation in her voice before she hung up. The silence stretched out for what felt like hours. Alone, in the stillness, Rick pulled out the old financial records from a drawer. He flipped through the papers one by one, mortgage statements, tax returns, the hidden agreements. His eyes lingered over the figures, the truth slowly unfolding in front of him. Jason had manipulated him from the start. He hadn't just convinced Emily to keep him paying for the house. He had convinced her to keep him in the dark, too. All these years, Rick had been nothing more than a pawn in their game. They had played him, kept him paying while they lived a lie, pretending everything was fine. The weight of the realization hit him hard. He wasn't just a fool. He was complicit in his own humiliation. And the worst part? He'd allowed it. He had let them get away with it for far too long. Rick dropped the papers onto the table, the sound sharp in the quiet room. His heart hammered in his chest, the anger finally bubbling up to the surface. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The game was about to change. And he wasn't going to be the one left in the dark anymore. Rick sat across from attorney Susan Klein in her small, dimly lit office, the scent of old books and coffee hanging in the air. The walls were lined with files and legal books, all neatly arranged, the kind of place where things were set in stone, where decisions were made in cold, sharp terms. Rick wasn't used to places like this. He was used to blueprints, work boots, and the raw weight of hard labor. But today, it was different. Today, he was here to change everything. Susan adjusted her glasses and flipped through the stack of documents Rick had brought. The mortgage papers, the tax returns, the agreements he'd signed years ago when Emily had asked for help. He'd trusted her. He had trusted all of them. But now, sitting in front of a lawyer, it felt like everything he'd done for her was being laid bare. Susan paused as she reached the final page. Her fingers lingered for a moment before she looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Rick," she said slowly, "I found something." Rick's stomach tightened. He knew it was coming, some legal loophole, some fine print he had overlooked, but hearing it out loud felt different. "There's a rarely used clause in this mortgage agreement," Susan continued, her voice calm, but heavy with implication. An acceleration clause. It allows you to demand the full balance of the mortgage immediately. All of it. Right now. Rick's mind raced, the words hitting him like a wave. He'd been paying this mortgage for years, and Emily had never once mentioned this. She'd promised him she would refinance, promised him she'd take care of it, but she hadn't. She hadn't even known about this clause. His hands clenched into fists on the table, a cold sense of vindication running through him. Emily had no idea what he was holding in his hands. Jason, too, he'd assumed Rick was too soft to ever go through with something like this. The arrogance of it all. The way they'd kept him in the shadows, treating him like an endless source of money, thinking he was weak enough to never fight back. But now, everything had changed. Rick's pulse quickened. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. It wasn't about the money anymore. It wasn't even about the house. It was about respect. It was about taking back control of his life, of no longer being the silent, invisible figure in the background of Emily's world. He didn't hesitate. "Get the papers ready. I want to sign them." Susan raised an eyebrow but didn't question him. She simply nodded, reaching for her printer to make the necessary copies. Rick sat back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window, where the first light of dawn was starting to peek through the blinds. Christmas Eve. The world outside was still, the snow falling softly against the city streets. It felt like the calm before the storm. He could hear the faint sound of distant Christmas carols, a reminder of the holiday that would soon be upon them. But for Rick, there would be no joy in this Christmas. Not anymore. The choice he'd made would set things in motion, and once it was done, there would be no going back. Emily and Jason had no idea what was coming. As Susan slid the papers in front of him, Rick reached for the pen without a second thought. The ink scratched across the paper. A final, decisive mark. He wasn't just canceling the mortgage. He was reclaiming his life, and Christmas would never be the same again. Rick's phone sat silently on the kitchen table. Still. Not a single buzz, not a ping. But he knew the message was coming. He could feel it in his bones. Emily had to know by now that something was different. The papers had been signed. The decision was made. There was no turning back. And sure enough, just as the day began to darken, the familiar buzz of his phone cut through the stillness. Emily's name flashed across the screen. Rick didn't need to read it to know what it would say. "Dad, where are you? Why aren't you answering? We need to talk." It was the same message she had sent before, empty, desperate, as if the years of distance between them could be bridged with a simple text. A part of him wanted to respond, to give her something, but he didn't. Not this time. This time, the silence felt heavier than any words he could offer. He let the phone sit there, face down, as if by not looking at it, he could stop the world from spinning. Jason's laughter rang in his ears. He could almost hear it, sharp, dismissive. He could picture him, standing in the doorway of Emily's house, the same smug grin on his face as he mocked Rick behind his back. "Your old man's just too soft. He'll never do anything. He won't take action." That laugh had always grated on Rick. But now, it was just noise. It didn't matter anymore. Rick's gaze drifted out the window, where the first flakes of snow had begun to fall, gently drifting from the sky. The landscape was quiet, serene, like the world was holding its breath. He stood up, walked to the porch, and stepped outside. The cold hit him immediately, the biting chill of the wind cutting through his shirt. But he didn't mind. He liked the cold. It was honest, real, like everything he had been through in the past few weeks. He leaned against the railing and watched the snow fall in silence. The world outside wrapped in a quiet blanket. It was peaceful here. No words, no expectations, just the stillness of the night. The only sound, the soft rustle of the snowflakes as they touched the ground. Inside, his phone buzzed again. The same text. "Dad, please. We need to talk." Still, he didn't respond. Rick had spent years chasing his daughter, trying to find a way to matter to her, trying to fill the silence that grew between them. But now, the silence didn't seem like a punishment. It felt like a choice. His choice. For the first time in ages, he wasn't desperate for her approval. He didn't need her validation. He had let go of the need to be seen. The calmness he felt was almost unsettling, the kind of calm that comes only when you know there's nothing left to lose. Susan's call came in shortly after. Her voice was steady, as always. "Rick, the notice has been filed with the bank. They've started processing it. They'll contact Emily soon." He nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Good." A small weight lifted off his chest. "Rick," Frank's voice followed, deep and unshaken. "Just wanted to confirm everything's in motion. It's only a matter of time now." Rick closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a quiet satisfaction ripple through him. It was done. There was no going back. The snow continued to fall, soft and steady, each flake blending into the next. The world outside, untouched by the chaos inside. He was ready. He wasn't sure what would come next, what Emily would do when she finally understood, but he knew he couldn't be swayed anymore. The silence had settled into him, and for the first time in years, it wasn't suffocating. It was liberating. The clock on the wall ticked, each second bringing him closer to the inevitable. He wasn't sure how long he stood there watching the snow fall, but he felt a quiet resolve growing inside him, stronger than the chill in the air. It was almost Christmas, and things were about to change. The evening had unfolded like a carefully choreographed performance. The guests arrived at Emily's house, dressed to the nines, their laughter loud and polished, filling the air with an energy that seemed as rehearsed as the decorations. It was everything she'd ever wanted, an elegant, flawless Christmas Eve dinner, an image of success, of wealth, of the life she had fought so hard to create. The house gleamed with perfection, the table set with fine china and crystal glasses, the scent of roast beef mingling with the sharp tang of mulled wine. Everything was in place, but Rick wasn't there. And it didn't matter how much they pretended, how much they smiled. He knew the truth, and soon they would too. The doorbell rang just as the last guest arrived. Emily moved to answer it, a smile still firmly in place. But her expression faltered when she saw the courier standing on the doorstep, holding a sealed envelope. A glance at the address, and she knew it was for her. She hesitated for only a moment, then took it, her fingers barely brushing the paper. The weight of the envelope felt strange in her hands, heavy in a way that didn't make sense for something so small. She turned and walked back into the room, her smile already beginning to fade. The laughter inside the house continued, but something felt off. The joy had a hollow edge to it, like everyone was just going through the motions. Emily slipped into the hallway, away from the crowd, and opened the envelope. Her eyes flicked over the contents, and for a moment, confusion clouded her features. Her gaze moved quickly over the printed words, then back again, disbelief slowly sinking in. The legal notice, the mortgage balance, due in 30 days. She blinked, trying to process the words, but they didn't make sense. The mortgage? Why was it due now? She hadn't been informed. She had never been told anything like this before. Her heart rate quickened as the realization hit her this wasn't a mistake. This wasn't just some misplaced piece of paper. This was real. And it was all happening now, on Christmas Eve, in front of everyone. She took a shaky breath, then stepped back into the room, trying to steady herself. Jason was there, standing near the fireplace, chatting with a guest. He didn't notice her at first, but then he turned, and the look on her face must have told him everything. His brow furrowed, the smile vanishing from his lips. He moved toward her, his expression shifting from confusion to something darker. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. Emily didn't answer right away. Instead, she handed him the envelope, her hands trembling. He took it from her without a word, his eyes scanning the notice quickly. As he read, his face drained of color. "No," Jason muttered under his breath. He looked up, his eyes wide as if he had been slapped. This can't be right." But it was. The mortgage, the full balance, all of it was due in 30 days. No more extensions, no more delays. This was the end. Across the room, Emily's guests had begun to notice the shift in energy. The whispers started almost immediately, soft at first, then growing louder as the tension in the room thickened. Jason stood frozen, the color slowly draining from his face as he processed the weight of the news. His usual arrogance faltered. For the first time, he looked vulnerable, unsure. Emily's world, the one they had worked so hard to create, was teetering on the edge of collapse. And in that moment, it wasn't just the mortgage they were losing. It was everything. Jason's eyes flicked toward the window, the Christmas lights outside still sparkling in the distance. And for the first time, he realized something he hadn't considered before. Rick wasn't the powerless old man he had so often mocked. No, Rick had always held the power. And now, in one cold, silent move, he was reclaiming it. Jason's gaze returned to Emily, the panic in his eyes impossible to ignore. The guests were still whispering, their eyes darting between them. Emily didn't know what to say. This Christmas Eve, the one that was supposed to be perfect, had just shattered. Emily's phone buzzed again, the same name flashing across the screen, Dad. The name that had once meant everything to her, now just a reminder of the mess she had created. She tapped the screen, but her finger hovered over the green icon, unsure whether to call or let it ring out. She hadn't spoken to him since Christmas Eve, since the legal notice had destroyed her carefully constructed world. But Rick wasn't answering. The phone buzzed again and again. Emily's hand tightened around the phone, but each time she tried to dial, her mind stalled. What could she say? What could she even say to fix this? She knew the words wouldn't undo the damage. They couldn't bring back what was lost. And deep down, she knew the truth: there was no going back. Jason's voice broke through her thoughts, his panic rising like a tidal wave. "Emily, this is your fault," he snapped, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You didn't even think to tell me, did you? You let this go on. Let it get to this point." His words were sharp, cutting through the room, drawing the attention of the few remaining guests. "Now look at us. Your dad's ruined everything. Do you even understand what's happening?" Emily flinched at the sound of his voice, her shoulders slumping under the weight of his accusation. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. All she could think about was Rick, the image of him standing alone in his house, listening to her text, to her silence. How could she have let it come to this? Guests had begun to file out, the air heavy with awkward glances and whispered comments. They could all feel it, the tension that had shifted from the excitement of a Christmas celebration to something darker, something irreversible. Their laughter, once so forced, now felt empty and hollow. They left, offering half-hearted goodbyes, but no one dared to make eye contact with her. The house, once filled with noise and warmth, was now silent, empty. A hollow shell of what it had been just hours ago. Emily sat on the couch, her eyes fixed on the floor, her fingers clenched around her phone. Jason had stormed out to the back porch, pacing and muttering to himself, his words lost in the cold air. Emily let the phone buzz one last time before she finally picked it up. Her hands shook as she listened to Rick's voicemail greeting. The message she had left him: "Dad, please, I don't know what's going on. Please call me. I'm sorry. Please, Dad, please," played back in her head, each word like a nail in her heart. She closed her eyes, tears threatening to spill over. She could feel the weight of everything she had done, the years of neglect, the lies, the silence. This wasn't just about money. It was about the years of pushing him away, of believing that her life with Jason was worth more than the man who had raised her, who had sacrificed everything for her. The phone buzzed again. It wasn't Rick this time. It was Lydia. "Dad's not answering, is he?" Lydia's voice was calm but full of concern. "What happened, Em? I know something's wrong. Just tell me." Emily bit her lip, her throat tight. She wanted to lie, to tell Lydia everything was fine, that it was just a misunderstanding, that they could fix this. But there was no way to lie to Lydia. Not anymore. I did something," Emily whispered, her voice breaking. "I pushed him too far, and now I don't know how to fix it." The silence between them stretched, but it was Lydia's next words that made Emily's chest tighten. "You need to tell him the truth. It's the only way." Emily stared at the phone in her hand, the truth hanging between them like a weight she couldn't shake. Would Rick ever forgive her? Would he even want to hear from her again? For the first time, she wasn't sure, and that uncertainty gnawed at her, deep and cold. Her fingers hovered over the phone screen, the weight of the moment pressing in on her. Would she call him, or let the silence stretch on even further? The front door of Rick's house creaked as the cold wind pushed against it, the shadows of dusk creeping over the front lawn. Rick was standing at the window, the weight of everything pressing in on him, when he heard the tires crunching on the gravel driveway. He didn't need to look to know who it was. Jason's truck, the one with the custom rims and polished black paint, screeched to a stop outside. Rick took a breath, steadying himself. This had been coming. He'd known it the moment the legal papers were filed. But still, the anger that boiled up inside him at the thought of Jason, of everything Jason had put him through, made his chest tighten. The door slammed open before Rick had a chance to move. Jason's face was red, his fists clenched at his sides as he stormed into the room. his boots thudding against the hardwood floors. The air between them crackled with tension, the kind that only comes when years of unresolved resentment finally boil over. "You ruined Christmas, you know that?" Jason spat, his voice sharp, venomous. "You've destroyed everything. This is supposed to be a holiday, a time for family, for celebration." He paced in front of Rick, his eyes wild, the fury obvious in every movement. "You forced my hand with this, Rick. You couldn't just let it go, could you? You had to get involved. You had to make it all about you." Rick stood his ground, his eyes calm, watching Jason as he ranted. He'd seen this before, the anger, the blaming, the way Jason always found someone else to pin his failures on. But this time, Rick wasn't backing down. Rick's voice was even calm, too calm. "You disinvited me, Jason." He let the words hang in the air, heavy with truth. "You made it clear where I stood. Don't blame me for your mess. You've been playing me for years. I didn't ruin Christmas, you did." Jason froze for a moment, his face twisting with rage. But then he surged forward, pointing an accusing finger at Rick. "You think you can just take everything from us? You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Well, let me tell you something, old man. I'll have you in court. I'll have every penny you've ever put into that house pulled out of your hands. You'll regret this. You're going to regret messing with me." Rick's jaw tightened at the threat, but he didn't flinch. He was done letting Jason walk all over him. "You want to take me to court?" Rick asked, his voice still low, still controlled. "You think you can fight me on this? Do you really think you have a leg to stand on?" Jason opened his mouth to speak, but Rick cut him off before he could say another word. "I'll let Susan handle this," he said, his voice firm, unyielding. Jason's expression faltered, just for a moment, before he sneered. "Susan Klein? You think she can save you from this? You're out of your league, Rick." Just as Jason's words rang in the air, Rick's phone buzzed on the table beside him. It was a message from Susan, confirming she'd already filed the necessary paperwork with the bank. The process was already in motion, and there was no turning back. Jason's eyes widened as he saw the confirmation on Rick's screen. His breath caught for a moment, and the fury on his face shifted, replaced by a dawning realization. He wasn't in control. Not anymore. "I don't need to fight you in court, Jason," Rick continued, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "You've already lost. All you've got now is a stack of legal papers and a sinking ship." Jason's face twisted with frustration, his eyes darting to the door, as if looking for some way to escape the suffocating truth. He opened his mouth to say something else, but Rick wasn't listening anymore. Emily had entered the room quietly, standing in the doorway, her face pale. Her eyes flickered between her husband and her father, her shame so palpable it seemed to fill the room. She hadn't spoken a word, hadn't defended either of them. She just stood there, silent, watching the wreckage of everything she'd helped create. Jason didn't acknowledge her. His anger was still directed solely at Rick, but Emily's presence hung like a cloud in the air. Her eyes, red from crying earlier, met Rick's for a fleeting moment before she quickly looked away. Rick felt the weight of her silence more than anything Jason could say. "Get out," Rick finally said, his voice cold, hard as stone. "You've said enough." Jason's face contorted with disbelief, but Rick didn't move, didn't flinch. The door was open, and Jason could either walk through it or keep fighting a battle he was destined to lose. The longer he stood there, the more ridiculous he looked. With one last glare, Jason turned and stormed toward the door, slamming it shut behind him. The house was quiet again. The only sound, the soft creak of the door as it settled back into place. Rick didn't move, didn't look at Emily. He wasn't sure he had the strength to. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and silently made a vow to himself. This time, he wouldn't let anyone take his power away. Not Jason, not Emily, no one. But as the door clicked shut, the silence between them felt even heavier than before. And Rick knew this was only the beginning. The dim light in Rick's living room flickered as he sat with Frank on the old couch, a stack of papers spread between them like an open wound. Frank had been pulling apart the layers of financial chaos for hours, his sharp eyes scanning documents with precision. But this was something else. Something bigger than Rick had expected. Frank leaned back, rubbing his eyes before pulling another folder from the pile. "You're not going to like this, Rick," he said, his voice lower than usual, tinged with something Rick couldn't quite place. "I've gone through everything. Mortgage papers, loan statements, the whole damn lot. There's something you didn't know. Something Emily didn't know either." Rick's breath caught in his chest. He had suspected Jason was hiding something, but nothing like this. Not this deep. Frank flipped open the file, the pages heavy with truth. Jason's got business loans, Rick. Several of them. And guess what? Emily's house is the collateral. Rick's hands froze, his pulse racing as the words sank in. Emily's house, the one he had helped keep afloat for so many years, was tied to Jason's reckless ventures, his failed business schemes. He'd been the one to protect the house all along, but he hadn't known it was more than just the mortgage he was keeping at bay. Jason had been gambling with the house, using it as a safety net, a backup plan for when his business plans fell apart. Frank's face was grim. It gets worse. Jason's planning to walk away once the equity's gone. He doesn't care about Emily or the house. He's just using her as a cushion until he can get out clean. Rick leaned back, his mind struggling to catch up with the enormity of it all. Jason had known. He'd used Emily's house, the one she'd worked so hard to keep perfect, as a pawn in a game he had no intention of winning, and Emily had been completely blind to it. Son of a... Rick muttered under his breath. The anger burned inside him, but it was nothing compared to the feeling of betrayal, the weight of realizing how thoroughly he'd been deceived. He wasn't just a fool who'd paid the bills. He was the safety net for a man who had never cared for Emily, for her family, for anything but his own ambitions. Before he could speak, Frank held up his hand, cutting him off. There's more. Rick looked at Frank, his brow furrowed. He didn't want to hear more, didn't want to know how deep the hole was. But he listened anyway, too afraid to stop now. Emily's house isn't the only thing Jason's been using as collateral, Frank said, his voice hard. There are other assets, business properties, vehicles, all tied into the same mess. Jason's been leveraging everything. If things keep going the way they are, the house won't be the only thing they lose. Everything's at risk, and Emily has no idea. She's been kept in the dark. Rick's stomach twisted with the full force of the betrayal. The house, the mortgage, it wasn't just a financial mess. It was a life built on lies. Emily had thought Jason was just doing what he could to provide, to help them live the life they wanted. But in reality, he was slowly sinking them both, drowning them in debts Rick had never even known existed. As if on cue, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Emily's voice floated through the door, light, casual, an attempt to escape the tension she felt but could never quite outrun. "Dad?" she called softly. Rick's heart dropped into his stomach. Emily had been standing just outside the room, listening. She had heard everything. The door cracked open, and Emily's face appeared in the threshold, pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. The moment her gaze locked with Rick's, everything shifted. The facade she'd been holding up, the smile she wore at dinner, the pretense that everything was fine, it all fell away in an instant. Her eyes flickered between Rick and Frank, then back to Rick, her voice breaking. "Is this true?" Rick didn't know how to answer her. Words seemed useless now. The truth was there, in the air, hanging between them like a heavy fog. Jason's betrayal had gone further than just the mortgage. It was a betrayal of everything she had ever trusted in, everything she thought she had. Emily stood in the doorway, her face unreadable for a moment before it cracked. Tears welled up in her eyes as the weight of the truth crushed down on her. "How could he?" she whispered, more to herself than anyone in the room. Rick's voice was quiet, filled with the sadness he had tried to hide for so long. "He never cared about you, Em. He only cared about what you could give him." The silence that followed was suffocating, the grief and anger hanging between them, unresolved. Emily didn't speak again. She just turned and walked away, the sound of her footsteps fading down the hall. Rick sat back in his chair, his hands trembling. This wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about everything. The trust, the lies, the love that had been twisted into something unrecognizable. The door slammed shut in the distance, and Rick knew this was the moment everything changed. He wasn't sure what would come next, but he understood one thing now. The fight wasn't over. Rick sat in the dim light of his kitchen, his hands wrapped tightly around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The phone sat on the table, silent for now, but he knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. He had given Emily an ultimatum. One meeting, and only on his terms. He couldn't keep playing the role of the silent martyr any longer. Too much had been taken, too many lines crossed. If this was going to end, it would end on his terms. The knock at the door was soft but unmistakable. Rick's pulse quickened despite himself. He stood and walked to the door, taking one last breath before opening it. Emily stood on the other side, her shoulders hunched, her hands tightly gripping the strap of her bag. She looked smaller than he remembered, the weight of everything pressing down on her. Her eyes were red, her lips trembling, but she didn't speak right away. Rick stepped aside, silently inviting her in. She crossed the threshold, her movements hesitant, like she was unsure of how to even exist in this space anymore. The silence between them felt heavier than it had in years, and neither of them knew how to bridge the distance. "Sit," Rick said, his voice low but steady. He gestured to the table, where the remains of his dinner sat untouched. Emily sat across from him, her hands nervously folding and unfolding in her lap. "I didn't think you'd agree," Emily whispered, her voice small, fragile. Rick didn't respond right away, his gaze fixed on her, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the series of events that had brought them here. The text, the house, Jason, everything. He had been willing to forgive her once, but now, he was done letting his daughter be controlled by someone who had never cared for her. "I agreed," Rick said finally, his voice firm, "because you're my daughter. But make no mistake, Emily, this is on my terms. I won't tolerate lies or manipulation anymore." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. Rick could see the struggle in her, the fight to hold everything together, to make the words come out. She took a breath, and when she spoke again, it was almost a confession. "I chose Jason. I chose the image, the life I thought I wanted, over you. I thought if I could make it look perfect, if I could keep up the facade, it would make everything else disappear. But it didn't. It just made it worse. And now, I don't know how to fix it." Rick listened without interrupting, his heart heavy but not softening. He had spent years trying to understand her, to bend to her needs, but now he needed her to understand him, to hear the words that had been buried for far too long. "Respect isn't something you can demand," Rick said slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "It's something you earn. You can't expect people to respect you if you don't respect them first, especially not your family. And you can't replace love with appearances, not without losing everything." Emily lowered her gaze, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. She knew he was right, but that didn't make it easier to hear. The phone buzzed on the table, cutting through the quiet like a knife. Rick glanced at it. Jason's name flashed on the screen, followed by a series of text messages. Threats, venomous words that made Rick's skin crawl. He didn't even look at the words. He simply swiped the phone to silent and pushed it aside. Emily looked at him, her eyes wide. "Aren't you going to?" "No," Rick cut her off, his voice a quiet warning. "He doesn't get to control this. Not anymore. I'm done playing his game." Emily's face faltered, guilt and confusion clouding her expression. "Rick, please, don't let this tear us apart." Rick's voice softened but remained resolute. "You're the one who let it get this far. Now, it's time to set boundaries. Real ones. No more lies. No more running from the truth." Rick stood and walked to the door, opening it, signaling that the conversation was over. Emily hesitated before standing up too, the weight of the moment pressing in on her. "Go home, Emily," he said, his voice quieter now. "You've got a lot of work to do." As she stepped out of the door and into the cold night, Rick felt something shift inside him. The door closed softly behind her, but in his chest, the silence roared. The game was on, and this time, he wasn't backing down. The news hit like a wave, spreading through the local papers and online outlets with a speed that Rick couldn't have anticipated. Jason's debts, the ones he had hidden so carefully, the ones he had used Emily's house to cover, were now out in the open. The articles were damning, the headlines bold, business tycoon's hidden liabilities exposed, family home at risk. It wasn't just the mortgage anymore. It was everything, the collapse of Jason's empire, the unraveling of the lies he had spun for years. Rick read the articles with a mixture of disbelief and cold satisfaction. He'd always known Jason was playing a dangerous game, but seeing the truth laid bare like this was still jarring. There were numbers large, intimidating sums, and the weight of each one pressed down on Emily's world. Her life, her family's future. Jason's phone rang off the hook. Calls came in from angry investors, creditors demanding answers, and former business partners who suddenly realized how deep the hole went. His reputation, once pristine, was crumbling faster than a house of cards. Rick could almost hear Jason's panic from where he sat, even though he was miles away. The arrogance, The smug superiority that had once been so evident in Jason's every word vanished. It was replaced with something else now. Fear. A fear that he had never shown before. But it wasn't just Jason feeling the weight of it. Emily's phone, too, buzzed incessantly. Messages from friends, family, even business associates asking what was happening, asking how they were going to survive this. The calls were all variations of the same question. What now? Later that afternoon, Rick stood in his kitchen, his hands braced against the counter. The weight of the moment was starting to settle in. Emily had been avoiding him since their last conversation, but he knew she couldn't avoid him forever. Not with everything falling apart around her. As expected, she called. Her voice, when it came through, was tight, strained. "I need to talk to you," she said, barely above a whisper. Rick's voice was steady. "You're right. We need to talk. But this time, it's on my terms." When Emily arrived, she looked different. The confidence, the image she had held on to for so long, was gone. In its place was a woman who had seen the truth and was now grappling with the weight of it. Her eyes were red, her face drawn, but there was something else, too, something quieter. A shift, a realization. "I'm filing for separation," she said, her voice cracking with the finality of it. "Jason, he's lost everything. He's dragged me down with him." Rick nodded, his gaze never wavering. "I won't rescue him, Emily. He made his choices, and now he'll have to face the consequences. He's had every chance." Her eyes met his, a flicker of something breaking through the facade she had built for so long. "I know," she said quietly. I thought he could fix it. But I was wrong." Rick looked at her, his voice low but firm. "You've been blind to what's been happening, but you're starting to see it now. It's time to stop running." Just then, Susan arrived, her presence calm and professional, as always. She had been working behind the scenes, restructuring deals to protect Emily's assets, her future but not Jason's. He had no claim here anymore. "We've made sure Emily's interests are secured," Susan said, looking at Rick before addressing Emily. "But Jason, he's on his own." Emily looked up at Susan, her face a mixture of relief and guilt. "I don't know what to do with him now," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Rick placed a hand on her shoulder, a small but steady gesture. "You do the same thing you've been doing all along, Emily. You face the truth. He chose this. You didn't." For the first time in a long while, Rick saw something change in her. It was subtle, an almost imperceptible shift, but it was there. A quiet understanding, a slow acknowledgement of the reality she had been running from. She wasn't the same person who had walked into his house that morning. As the door closed behind her, Rick leaned back against the counter, his mind racing with the uncertainty of what was to come. Jason's empire was crumbling. Emily's marriage was over, but the real question lingered. What was next? Rick wasn't sure, but one thing was certain: the pieces were falling into place. The bank lobby was unusually quiet when Jason walked in, his footsteps sharp and quick against the polished marble floor. He had come for one reason and one reason only: Rick. He had spent the morning in a haze of panic, watching his carefully constructed world collapse in real time. The calls were nonstop. The emails, the demands, the creditors pulling at his every corner. But none of that mattered now. All that mattered was getting Rick to back down. He'd let the legal documents slide. He'd let the public exposure slide. But this was personal. Rick had gone too far. He was ruining everything. Jason stormed through the entrance, his expression tight, the edges of his jaw clenched. The tellers barely glanced up as he passed, knowing all too well the kind of man he was, the kind of reputation he carried. He walked straight to the counter where Rick was waiting, casually flipping through a stack of papers, as if he had all the time in the world. Jason's voice broke the silence like a crack of thunder. "You're a damn fool, you know that, Rick?" he spat, his eyes narrow with fury. "You think you've won, don't you? All you've done is make yourself a target." Rick didn't flinch. He set the papers down, his fingers moving slowly, deliberately, like he wasn't even fazed by the venom in Jason's words. "I'm not the one who dug this hole, Jason," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying an edge that was unmistakable. "You've been digging it for years, and now it's finally catching up to you." Jason stepped forward, his face twisted in a sneer, his voice rising. "You think you're so smart, huh? What, you think you're some kind of hero now? Some knight in shining armor for your daughter? "You're a joke, Rick. You're just an old man who spent his life working with his hands, thinking he's got some moral high ground." Rick stood his ground, his eyes steady, unwavering. "It's not about being a hero. It's about doing the right thing. Something you wouldn't understand." Jason's face turned red with anger, the insults spilling from his lips without pause. "Right thing? Your right thing? You've been living in the past your whole damn life. What do you know about how the world works now? You think because you paid a few bills, you're suddenly in charge?" He laughed bitterly, taking a step back, as if daring Rick to challenge him. "You're just a washed-up old man, Rick. A relic. You don't belong here. You never did." Rick's fingers tightened around the edge of the counter, but he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I don't need to belong here," he said, his voice as calm as the stillness before a storm. "But you? You needed me to keep paying your debts, and you've made Emily think you were worth fighting for." Jason froze. There it was. The raw truth that Rick had kept buried inside for so long, a truth Jason couldn't hide from anymore. "You don't get to play the victim here," Rick added. "You didn't just use her, you used me too." The words hung between them, thick and suffocating. Jason opened his mouth to say something, but Rick cut him off. Reaching into his coat pocket, he pulled out his phone. "You want to hear something?" he asked, as he pressed play. Jason's face turned pale as the recorded conversation filled the air. It was Jason's voice, unmistakable, talking to one of his associates. The words were sharp, calculating. "Once the house is gone, I'm out. I'll let her keep it all, but I'm walking away clean. She'll never know what hit her." The recording continued. More conversations, more lies, more manipulation. Jason's face went white. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. "Do you recognize your own voice?" Rick asked, his gaze cold and unyielding. "This is what you did to her, to Emily. You never gave a damn about her house, or her future. You only cared about yourself." Jason's anger reached its boiling point. "You son of a..." He lunged across the counter, his hand raised as if to strike. But before he could make contact, security rushed in, grabbing him by the arms and pulling him back. The panic in Jason's eyes was clear, his voice trembling with rage. "You think you've won?" Jason shouted, his face twisted with fury. "This isn't over, Rick. You'll pay for this. You think I'm just going to let you destroy everything?" Security officers, efficient and calm, moved swiftly, escorting Jason out of the bank with practiced ease. He continued shouting, thrashing in their grip, but the more he screamed, the more it felt like the last desperate gasp of a man who had already lost. Emily stood in the doorway, her face pale, her hands clenched tightly by her sides. She had been watching the confrontation from a distance, and now, as the scene settled, the full weight of everything hit her. Her gaze met Rick's, and for the first time, there was no anger, no defiance in her eyes, only something raw, something she had never allowed herself to feel. Shame. Rick didn't speak. He didn't need to. The truth had already been laid bare. As Jason's shouts faded into the distance, Rick stood firm, his back straight, his shoulders squared. He wasn't done. He had made his move, and now there was no turning back. But Emily, standing there, shattered, her eyes filled with a quiet horror, was the real question now. What would she do next? Would she finally see what Rick had done for her, or would she let everything else come crashing down around them? The tension hung thick in the air, and Rick knew whatever happened next, it was only the beginning. The apartment was smaller than Emily had expected, but in some ways, it felt like a fresh start. The walls were bare, the rooms sparsely furnished, and yet there was something about the space that felt more honest, more hers. She stood by the window, watching the world outside, the quiet hum of the city life below. Her life, the life she had built on the illusion of success. Now, that illusion had crumbled, and all that was left was the reality of the choices she'd made. She had moved out of the house, left Jason behind in the wreckage of his own making, and taken on the mortgage she had spent years pretending wasn't hers. At first, she had considered walking away completely, but that wasn't an option anymore, not after the mess Jason had created. She couldn't keep running from responsibility. The mortgage was hers now, and it was her problem to fix. But Rick had made one thing clear. He wouldn't give her money. Not anymore. The days of him paying her way were over. He had made his decision, and now she had to make hers. It was the hardest thing she'd ever done to swallow her pride and accept that she was no longer a victim in this, that the choices she had made had led her here. Rick had always been there for her too much so. Maybe he had let her take advantage of his loyalty, his willingness to sacrifice. But no more. He offered advice, not money. He told her what she needed to hear, not what she wanted to hear. "You're going to have to make this work," he had said, his voice steady. "You've got a chance now, Emily. Don't waste it. But you do it on your own. You don't need him to fix this. You fix it." Those words echoed in her mind as she sat down on the worn-out couch, the one she'd picked up from a second-hand store, the only thing that felt familiar in this new life. She could still feel the sting of the confrontation with Jason, the realization that the man she had loved and trusted had been nothing more than a charade. The lawsuits against him were already piling up, and the weight of his actions was pressing in on her, just as much as it was on him. His business was unraveling, his name dragged through the mud, and she had no choice but to watch, to know that every decision he made had dragged her into this mess. But in the silence of the apartment, there was a part of Emily that could breathe again. For the first time, she wasn't pretending. She wasn't hiding. The weight of the shame she had carried for so long was finally starting to lift, replaced by something else: determination. Later that afternoon, Lydia came over. She knocked gently, and when Emily opened the door, Lydia's smile was soft but proud. "You're doing the right thing," Lydia said quietly, her eyes searching Emily's face for any signs of the girl she used to be. Emily nodded, feeling the tears well up, but she didn't let them fall. She wasn't that person anymore. Rick had helped her find her footing in a way no one else could. Lydia had been there to remind her that it wasn't too late to change, that the shame didn't define her. It was what came next that mattered. "I'm proud of you," Lydia said, her voice steady, full of the strength Emily had once admired in her. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. "I don't know if I'm proud of me yet," she whispered, the vulnerability in her voice raw. "But I will be." Rick had given her the clarity to see the path ahead, to understand that this was where the real work began. The mortgage, the debts, the separation from Jason, all of it was a mess she would have to clean up. But she could do it. She had to. As Lydia left, Emily stood at the door, watching her go. There was no turning back now. Jason's world was falling apart. His name was being dragged through the courts, and his empire, everything he had built, was crumbling. The power had shifted. For the first time in a long time, Emily had control over her own life. The balance had tipped in a way that no one could undo. And as she looked out of her new window, the city bustling below, Emily felt a quiet sense of peace slowly settling in. She wasn't where she had expected to be, but she was where she needed to be. Now, it was her turn to rebuild. Rick sat at his old wooden desk, the papers in front of him scattered like puzzle pieces waiting to be put together. He'd lived his life on instinct, his hands used to holding tools and turning wrenches, but now they were steady as he gripped the pen. There was no turning back. His mind was clear. The decision had been made long ago, but now he was putting it into writing. The will, the final decision on what would happen to everything he'd worked for. His hard-earned money, his house, his legacy. It all needed to be set down in a way that no one could undo. He had been too passive, too willing to let others decide the fate of his life. But not anymore. Not with Emily. Not with Jason. The power he had given away was no longer his to surrender. He had been a fool to let them dictate his choices for so long. But now, he was taking back control. The pen hovered over the paper as he read through the legal language once more. The trust fund was necessary, yes, but it had to be done with conditions. He couldn't let Emily inherit everything without knowing she was capable of standing on her own, of accepting responsibility for the mess she had helped create. This wasn't a gift, it was a lesson. He took a breath and signed his name at the bottom of the page. The decision was final. The twist of the will wasn't just about money, though. It was about accountability. The trust was structured so that Emily would inherit, but only after proving she could manage what was hers. The condition was clear: she had to demonstrate responsibility, integrity, and the courage to face the mistakes she had made. If she couldn't do that, The money would go elsewhere. She couldn't coast through life anymore on the coattails of her past mistakes. And Jason? He was fully excluded. No legacy. No safety net. Rick wouldn't let him slip away unscathed. Jason had made his bed, and now he would lie in it. Rick had been blind for too long, thinking that Jason could change. But Jason was a predator, not a partner, and Rick wouldn't reward that behavior. He wouldn't let him use Emily or anyone again. The finality of it all weighed on him, but Rick didn't flinch. He had made his peace with the decisions that needed to be made. He was no longer worried about the fallout. Not from Jason, not from Emily. This was his final act of love for his daughter, the only thing he could do to ensure that she had a shot at true independence. Hours later, Emily sat across from Rick, her eyes unsure as she stared at the document before her. She had arrived at his house, the air between them thick with unspoken words. When she saw the will, she froze. It wasn't like the inheritance she had imagined. She expected it to be easy, a simple transfer of wealth. But the conditions? They stung. "Dad, are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice tentative. "You're really going to make me prove myself?" Rick looked at her, the hardness in his gaze softening just slightly. "You've got to earn it, Emily. You've been given everything for so long. This time, you're going to have to show that you can take responsibility for your life. I'm not doing this to punish you. I'm doing this because I love you. It's time for you to stop running." Emily sat back in her chair, the weight of his words sinking in. The anger she felt was quickly replaced by something deeper understanding. Her eyes flicked over the conditions, her mind racing, but there was no arguing it. The stakes were too high. She didn't want to admit it, but deep down, she knew Rick was right. She had taken too much for granted, had allowed herself to be blinded by the comfort of Jason's promises. She signed the document without another word. Rick watched her, a part of him wondering if she truly understood the gravity of what she was agreeing to. But he also knew this was the only way forward. The last bridge had been burned. Emily was taking the first steps toward real change, and there was no turning back now. As she left, the door clicking shut behind her, Rick sat alone in the quiet of the house, the papers now sealed. His breath, steady but deep, filled the room. He had done it. He had taken back control of his life, of his legacy. But the future still felt uncertain. The real test was ahead. Would Emily rise to the challenge? Or would she stumble again? Rick's hand hovered over the phone, his thoughts lingering on the last conversation he'd had with Jason. The final break had been sealed. Jason was gone from his life for good. And Emily, well, that part of the story was still unfolding. The silence in the room felt like an open question, and Rick couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was yet to come. The first few weeks after everything fell apart felt like a blur to Emily. She threw herself into work, 2 jobs, sometimes 3, just to keep the weight of her decisions from crushing her. The bills piled up, and she had no choice but to face the reality of the mess she had made. Jason was gone, the house was no longer in her hands, and now it was all on her. The nights were long, the exhaustion unbearable, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The truth was, Emily didn't know what else to do. She worked at a small cafe during the day, serving coffee to people who didn't know her name, didn't care to. It was mindless, repetitive, but it paid the rent on her tiny apartment. In the evenings, she cleaned office buildings, sweeping floors, wiping down windows, the monotony almost comforting in its predictability. Every minute she spent moving, working, was a minute she didn't have to think about the shame that clung to her like a shadow. At night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the silence too loud. She thought about Rick, about the way he had made her stand on her own, about the will and the responsibility she had taken on. She knew he was right. She'd taken too much for granted, let her life slip away into the hands of someone who never cared. But now, as she clawed her way back from the wreckage, she had a strange, gnawing feeling. She was finally starting to understand what it meant to have to earn her place in the world. Rick, meanwhile, watched from a distance. He didn't make it obvious, didn't try to intervene, but he saw everything. The way Emily kept her head down, the exhaustion etched into her features every time she passed him in the hallway or sent a quick text. He had given her the space she needed. He knew that now, more than ever, it was up to her to fix what had been broken. But part of him was still unsure if she could ever truly make amends. Lydia noticed the shift in Rick. She had seen the struggle in his eyes when Emily first left, when the silence between them seemed like it might swallow him whole. But now, as they sat around Lydia's table, the warmth of New Year's dinner filling the room, Rick was laughing again. A genuine laugh. It wasn't the kind that came from avoiding pain or hiding behind a mask. It was real. Lydia smiled as she watched him, knowing that, despite everything that had happened, Rick had come through stronger. The man who had always sacrificed for others, who had once let himself fade into the background, had found his voice again. He wasn't invisible anymore. The evening was quiet, filled with the easy conversation of family, the clinking of glasses and silverware. Lydia had set the table with care, the way she always did for the few occasions they shared. Rick felt the weight of it all, but in the warmth of the room, he finally felt some peace. He had given Emily the chance she needed, and she was taking it slowly but surely. The doorbell rang late that evening, interrupting their conversation. Lydia shot Rick a curious look as she rose to answer it. When she returned, it was with an envelope in her hand. "For you," she said, handing it to him without saying a word more. Rick looked down at the envelope, the handwriting unmistakable. It was Emily's. His chest tightened, but he didn't open it immediately. Instead, he held it in his hand, feeling the weight of what was inside. Lydia sat back, watching him carefully. "Go ahead," she said softly, sensing the gravity of the moment. Rick slowly tore open the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note, simple yet powerful. Emily's words, raw and unguarded, filled the page. "Dad, I can't ever take back the things I did, but I'm working to be better. I'm sorry. I've learned what it means to be responsible. I hope you can forgive me." Rick sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the words. He could hear her voice in his head as he read, and despite the years of hurt, the damage that had been done, a small part of him began to thaw. She had made mistakes. They both had. But Emily was trying. He could feel it in the simple apology, the quiet admission of guilt. Lydia watched him, a slight smile on her lips. "She's getting there," she said quietly. Rick nodded, his voice hoarse as he replied, "She is." He folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his pocket, not knowing what to do with it yet, but knowing it would stay with him. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it was everything. He wasn't sure if they would ever fully heal, but the door had opened just a crack, and that was enough for now. As the evening went on, the room filled with laughter once more, but Rick could feel something shift. Emily had taken the first step, one he had never thought she would, and that made all the difference. But the future still loomed large, and Rick knew that the hardest part was still to come. The coffee shop was quiet on that rainy morning, the kind of place where the world outside seemed to pause, leaving only the soft hum of machines and the scent of freshly ground beans in the air. Rick sat at a small table by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. He wasn't sure what to expect when he agreed to meet Emily, but here he was, waiting. He'd kept his distance from her for months, giving her the space she needed to rebuild her life. But today felt different. Today, he was willing to listen. When Emily walked in, he barely recognized her. It wasn't just the way she'd changed physically. Her hair was shorter, her face a little more worn from the weight of the last few months. It was the way she moved. The nervous energy was gone, replaced with something steadier. She seemed smaller than he remembered, but in a way that felt more vulnerable than weak. She had been humbled. She spotted him at the table, her steps hesitant, but she didn't hesitate to sit down across from him. Her eyes flicked up, meeting his, but they quickly dropped to the table, like she couldn't bear the weight of his gaze for long. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Rick watched her carefully, the silence between them stretching thin. The last time they'd been this close, the air had been thick with anger, regret, and distance. But now there was something different. Something softer, quieter. Emily cleared her throat, her voice shaky. I'm sorry, Dad, for everything I put you through. I was so blinded by everything. The image I wanted to project, the life I thought I was supposed to have. I didn't see what it was doing to you. I didn't see how much I was hurting you. Rick didn't respond immediately. The apology hung there, raw and heavy in the air between them. He had waited so long for it, but hearing her say the words didn't bring instant relief. It was hard to separate the apology from the past. from the way she had treated him, from the way she had chosen Jason over him, over the family. But in her voice, in the way she said it, he knew she wasn't just saying the words because she thought she should. She meant it. "You've made mistakes, Emily," Rick said, his voice low, steady. "We both have. But what matters now is what you do with it. I've been trying to figure out if I can trust you again." Emily nodded, her eyes glistening with tears she refused to shed. "I get that. And I'm not asking you to forgive me right away. I know I don't deserve it. But I've been working. Really working. And I want to be better. For you, for me, for all of us." Rick studied her for a moment. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, the quiet determination she hadn't had before. But the road to healing was never going to be quick or easy. He couldn't just flip a switch and erase the damage. Forgiveness wasn't something you could give in a moment. It was something you had to earn. "I forgive you, Emily," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "But that doesn't mean I've forgotten. Trust doesn't come back overnight. You've got a long way to go." Emily's shoulders slumped, but there was relief in her eyes. She had expected that response. She'd known it wouldn't be easy. "I understand," she said softly, her voice small but steady. Rick leaned back in his chair, the weight of the conversation pressing on him, but in a way that didn't feel suffocating. For the first time in months, he felt lighter, like the years of resentment and bitterness that had built up between them were slowly starting to break apart. He had set his boundaries, and she had respected them. They were both still standing, still here. Maybe that was enough for now. "So what now?" Emily asked, the question hanging in the air. Rick looked out the window, the rain still falling softly, washing the streets clean. "We rebuild. Slowly. It's going to take time, and it's not going to be easy. But we'll figure it out. Together." As they sat in the silence that followed, a new kind of understanding settled between them. There was still a long road ahead, but the first step had been taken. Jason, the chaos he brought into their lives, had disappeared. He was gone now, lost in his own downfall, a distant memory of a time they no longer had to carry. Emily's phone buzzed, but she didn't reach for it. Instead, she smiled weakly at Rick. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for giving me a chance." Rick didn't answer immediately, but the words felt less difficult to say now. "It's not about giving chances anymore, Emily. It's about what you do with them." She nodded, her eyes brighter now, but the uncertainty still lingered. They both knew the journey was far from over, but for the first time, in a long while, it felt like it might be worth the effort. And in that moment, Rick felt the first flicker of hope. The next Christmas arrived quietly, like the soft hush of snow falling outside. The house was still and calm, the air crisp with the scent of pine and cinnamon, and the soft crackling of the fire in the living room filled the silence. It wasn't the grand celebration Rick had once imagined, but it was something more. It was real. And for the first time in years, it felt like Christmas wasn't just about the image, the perfection. It was about what truly mattered. Rick had kept the dinner small this year. Just him, Lydia, and Emily. No extravagant decorations, no guests from Jason's circle, no forced laughter, just family. The kind of family Rick had always wanted, but had spent so many years trying to force into a mold that never quite fit. Emily had come early to help with the cooking, an unexpected shift in their dynamic that Rick couldn't quite explain, but was grateful for nonetheless. She was quieter than usual, the tension between them still there, but softened, now tempered by time and understanding. The way she moved around the kitchen was different. There was no rush, no overcompensating, just a steady rhythm of chopping vegetables, stirring the sauce, her hands working with purpose. She didn't speak much, but her presence was grounding. It wasn't the forced effort of someone trying to make up for their mistakes. It was just her. A daughter helping her father prepare a simple meal. There was no more embarrassment in the way she looked at him, no awkwardness in the way they moved through the motions together. There was only humility, the kind that comes from truly understanding the value of what you have, not what you wish for. Rick felt it, too, the absence of the resentment that had once been so thick between them. He had been angry for so long, feeling like an invisible bystander in his own family, watching as his sacrifices went unnoticed, as his love was used like an endless bank account. But now, the air between them was clear. He could see it in Emily's eyes, the subtle but unmistakable shift in how she regarded him. No more distance, No more pretending. When dinner was finally ready, they sat down at the small table, Lydia joining them with a soft smile. There was no grand speech, no dramatic apology, just a quiet acknowledgement that they had all survived the storm. They passed the food around, and for the first time in a long time, Rick felt the weight of the years lift from his shoulders. The conversation was light, easy. They talked about the past, but without bitterness, more like distant memories that didn't sting anymore. They spoke of the future, too, with cautious optimism. The tension from previous Christmases, the pressure of expectations, was gone. Emily didn't try to prove anything. She just was. Rick didn't need her to be perfect anymore. He just needed her to show up, and she had. The snow continued to fall softly outside, coating the world in a blanket of white. It was beautiful, almost serene, and for the first time in years, Rick felt peace settle into the quiet of the room. There was no rush, no frantic need to get through the night. He felt respected not because of anything he had done, but because of what had finally been understood. The boundaries had been set, the lines had been redrawn, and Emily had chosen to meet him there. After dinner, Lydia excused herself, leaving Rick and Emily alone in the living room. The silence was comfortable, not awkward. Emily sat next to him, her eyes soft, no longer guarded. For the first time in what felt like forever, Rick didn't feel like he had to protect her. She was standing on her own, and maybe, just maybe, they could start building something real. As they sat there, the fire crackling softly in front of them, Rick looked over at Emily. "You've come a long way," he said quietly. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the fire. "I know. I don't expect you to forget everything, but I'm trying." Rick reached over, placing a hand gently on hers, the gesture quiet but full of meaning. He had spent so many years angry, so many years hoping for things to change, but now he didn't need anything else. He had this moment. The snow continued to fall outside, the world wrapped in its soft, unbroken blanket. Peace had finally come soft, slow, but real. And in that stillness, Rick knew that the hardest part was over. But as the night stretched on, there was still a lingering question, one that Rick couldn't shake. Could this new beginning truly last? Or was this just the calm before another storm? The quiet still held, but the future loomed. Rick sat in the quiet of his living room, the soft hum of the clock on the wall, the only sound. His fingers lightly traced the edge of an old family photo album that lay on the coffee table, its cover worn from years of use. He hadn't opened it in a long time, hadn't wanted to, but today, something about the stillness of the moment pulled him in. It wasn't the first time he'd found himself reflecting on the past, but today, he was different. Today, he saw it all through new eyes. He thought back to that night, that text from Emily, the one that had come in the middle of everything. "Don't come, Dad, you embarrass us." It had hit him like a gut punch. The words had stung, had burned, but he hadn't responded. Not right away, and not because he didn't have something to say. He had a lot to say. The anger had been there, the hurt, the disappointment, the betrayal. But something had stopped him. Something about that silence had felt more powerful than any words he could have sent back. Silence, he realized, had given him clarity. Rick had spent so many years speaking up, trying to fix things, trying to make people understand. But in that moment, the silence wasn't a weakness. It was a statement. It was his refusal to be a doormat, to let his love be used as leverage, to let his value be reduced to a transaction. He hadn't been angry at Emily when he didn't reply. He hadn't been cold, either. He had just stepped back, letting her see the consequences of her choices. He knew now that love didn't mean submission. It didn't mean turning the other cheek, letting the people you cared about walk all over you. That was a lie he'd believed for too long. True love, the kind that lasted, had to be built on respect, not on sacrifice alone. Respect had to be mutual. It couldn't just flow one way, from him to her. It couldn't be him bending over backward, sacrificing pieces of himself, while she stayed comfortable in her world of privilege and convenience. Rick ran his thumb over a photo in the album, an old family picture of Emily when she was just a little girl, her face bright with joy, her eyes full of innocence. He could almost hear her laughter echoing through the years, the way it used to fill their house before things got complicated. The nostalgia tugged at him, but it wasn't the same ache it had been in the past. The pain was softer now, tempered by the lessons he'd learned. He had done the right thing. Emily had finally started to understand what he had been trying to teach her all along, that actions had consequences. And now, he was starting to see the fruits of his choice. Emily was changing, slowly, but she was changing. Rick looked at the family photos again, this time with a sense of pride. He had been there for her in ways he hadn't even recognized. He had set the boundaries, forced the silence, and given her the space to grow. She was no longer the girl who expected everything to be handed to her. She was starting to take ownership of her life. And for the first time in years, Rick felt proud. Proud of the man he had become. Proud of the father he had been, and was still trying to be. As he closed the photo album, a soft smile crossed his face. He had his family back, even if it was in a different way than he had imagined. He wasn't invisible anymore. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. But even as he smiled, a thought lingered in the back of his mind. Would Emily's progress be enough to truly heal the wounds? Would Jason's shadow still linger over them? Or had they finally shed it for good? The quiet, once uncomfortable, now felt full of possibilities. But the future was still uncertain. Rick knew that. And he couldn't help but wonder, how far had they really come? The street was quiet as Rick's old truck rumbled down the road, the cold air biting through the cracks in the windows. The first snow of the season was starting to fall softly, settling gently on the ground, covering the world in a layer of white. It felt like the perfect metaphor, the world being wiped clean, a fresh start. The kind of start Rick had been longing for. But as he neared the house, his heart tightened. Emily's house. It had been months since he'd last driven by. Months since he had made the decision that had felt like a weight lifting off his chest, the day he signed the papers that canceled the mortgage he had paid for so long. The house had been her dream, her perfect life. And for years, Rick had silently shouldered the burden, hoping, praying that his daughter would see the sacrifices he'd made for her. But now, looking at it from a distance, it felt like something else. Something that didn't belong to him anymore. He slowed the truck as he approached the familiar street. The house was still there, standing tall, its windows glowing faintly with the warmth of the Christmas lights she had put up months ago. But this time, it wasn't just a symbol of his love for Emily. It wasn't a reminder of the debt he had quietly carried for her. It was a reminder of what he had finally taken back. Every payment he had made, every sacrifice he had given, every month he had written a check without hesitation, they all rushed back to him in that moment. The years of feeling invisible, of being used, of watching her grow more distant while Jason's influence over her only deepened. He had loved her, had done everything in his power to make sure she had a future. But in the end, all it had done was make him feel smaller, weaker. It had drained him. Rick stopped the truck at the edge of the street, just out of sight of the house, his breath steady despite the storm of emotions that had begun to churn inside him. He knew this moment had been coming for a long time. Canceling the mortgage hadn't been about punishing Emily. It hadn't been about exacting some kind of revenge on her. It had been about taking back his dignity. It had been about showing both of them that love wasn't supposed to be a one-way street. That respect had to be earned, not demanded. And that was something she needed to learn. He took a deep breath, his hand on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the house. The snow continued to fall, the world outside slowly fading into a quiet blur. Rick didn't need to see it anymore. He didn't need to feel the weight of the house on his shoulders. It was done. The mortgage was canceled. Emily was going to have to face the consequences of her choices. But more importantly, he was finally going to have to face his own. He pulled the truck away, the engine purring softly as he turned down the road. His fingers gripped the wheel tightly, but there was something else in his chest now. It wasn't the familiar ache of guilt or anger. It was something else, something lighter, the kind of relief that comes with knowing you've done what's necessary, even when it hurts. Rick parked the truck in front of his house, the snow falling around him in soft, lazy flurries. He opened the door and stepped out into the cold. The crunch of the snow beneath his boots was a reminder of how everything had shifted, how far he had come from the man who used to let others decide his worth. For the first time in years, Rick didn't feel small. He didn't feel invisible. He stood there, letting the cold air hit his face, his chest rising and falling steadily as he looked out into the quiet world around him. He had done it. He had given her a chance to stand on her own. And maybe, just maybe, it would be the wake-up call she needed. He walked into the house confidently, his steps purposeful. And as the door closed behind him, he smiled. The weight of the world finally lifted. The lesson was harsh, but it was one that needed to be learned. For both of them. "I didn't cancel the mortgage to punish her," Rick said quietly to himself as he closed his eyes for a moment. "I did it so she'd finally see me." But even as he said the words, a quiet doubt lingered. Would Emily ever truly understand? Would she see it for what it was? And in the silence that followed, the questions echoed, unanswered.